The radio operator pressed the handset closer to his ear and repeated the call sign. There was no response. He adjusted the frequency, checked the antenna connection, and tried again. Still nothing. The platoon leader stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the tree line. The extraction window had been set for 1400 hours. It was now 1630. The helicopters had not arrived. Vietnam presented the United States Army with an operational environment unlike any it had encountered in previous conflicts. Dense jungle canopy, extreme humidity, limited road infrastructure, and an enemy that avoided conventional engagement created conditions in which traditional ground maneuver proved difficult and costly. The helicopter became the primary solution to these challenges. It allowed American units to move quickly across terrain that would take days to traverse on foot. It delivered supplies to positions that could not be reached by vehicle. Most importantly, it provided a means of extraction when ground forces completed their missions or when contact with the enemy made withdrawal necessary. This reliance on rotary wing aircraft was not merely a tactical preference. It became the foundation of American strategy in Vietnam. Infantry units were inserted into remote areas, conducted reconnaissance or search operations, and were then lifted out before the enemy could mass forces against them. The term used for these operations was airmobile. The concept depended entirely on the availability of helicopter support. When that support was present, American forces enjoyed a degree of mobility and flexibility that the enemy could not match. When it was absent, those same forces found themselves isolated in hostile territory with no clear means of withdrawal. The 3rd Platoon of Bravo Company had been operating in the Central Highlands for 6 days. Their mission was to patrol a sector of jungle northwest of a firebase that had reported movement consistent with enemy supply routes. The area was not considered a high-priority target. There were no known base camps, no major trails, and no recent intelligence suggesting significant enemy presence. The operation was classified as routine. The platoon consisted of 28 men, including the platoon leader, a first lieutenant with 11 months in country, a platoon sergeant with 2 prior tours, 3 squad leaders, and the usual complement of riflemen, grenadier, and machine gunners. They carried standard load: rifles, ammunition, grenades, rations for 7 days, water purification tablets, and 1 radio capable of reaching the company command post. The insertion had occurred without incident. 2 Huey helicopters had landed in a clearing 3 kilometers from the patrol area. The platoon had disembarked, and the aircraft had departed within 90 seconds. The sound of the rotors faded quickly. The jungle absorbed noise in a way that made distance difficult to judge. Within minutes, the only sounds were insects, birds, and the occasional movement of the men as they adjusted their gear and prepared to move. For the first 3 days, the platoon found nothing. They moved slowly through the undergrowth, maintaining noise discipline, checking terrain features against their maps, and reporting their position twice daily via radio. The vegetation was thick enough that visibility rarely exceeded 10 meters. Navigation required constant attention to compass headings and pace counts. The heat was oppressive. Men rotated the point position every hour to prevent fatigue from degrading alertness. Water consumption was carefully rationed. Resupply had been planned for day 5, but the platoon leader had emphasized that they needed to conserve resources in case the schedule changed. On the 4th day, they discovered a trail. It was not marked on their map. The path was narrow, recently used, and ran generally east to west. The platoon sergeant examined the ground and noted footprints, bicycle tire marks, and evidence of loads being dragged. He estimated the trail had been used within the past 48 hours. The platoon leader radioed the information to the company command post and requested further instructions. The response came within 30 minutes. They were to observe the trail but not to engage unless fired upon. Extraction would proceed as planned on day 7. The platoon established an observation position 30 meters from the trail in dense cover. They settled into a routine of silent watching. 2 men maintained observation at all times, while the others rested, ate, or quietly maintained equipment. The trail saw little activity during daylight. Twice, small groups of individuals passed, moving quickly and carrying equipment that suggested they were part of a logistical network. The platoon did not engage. Their orders were to gather information, not to initiate contact. By the 6th day, rations were running low. The men had been careful, but 7 days in the jungle with limited resupply required precise calculation. The platoon leader reduced meal frequency and reminded the squad leaders to enforce water discipline. Morale remained stable. The mission had been uneventful, and the prospect of extraction the following day provided a clear endpoint. The men understood that discomfort was temporary. On the morning of Day 7, the platoon leader made radio contact with the company command post and confirmed the extraction plan. The designated landing zone was 2 kilometers south of their current position. It was the same clearing where they had been inserted. The extraction was scheduled for 1400 hours. The platoon would need to begin movement by noon to reach the landing zone with time to establish security and mark the site for the incoming helicopters. The company radio operator acknowledged the plan and confirmed that helicopter assets had been allocated. The platoon broke down the observation position and began moving toward the landing zone at 11:45. Movement was slow, the terrain was difficult, and the platoon leader wanted to avoid unnecessary noise or signs of passage. They reached the edge of the clearing at 13:30 and established a perimeter. The landing zone was empty and quiet. The clearing was roughly circular, approximately 60 meters in diameter, with grass that had grown back since their insertion. The platoon sergeant positioned the squads in a defensive arc and instructed the men to remain concealed in the tree line. The radio operator established communication with the command post and reported that they were in position and ready for extraction. The response was immediate. Helicopter departure had been delayed due to maintenance issues with one of the aircraft. The new estimated time of arrival was 1500 hours. The platoon leader acknowledged the message and passed the information to the squad leaders. Delays were not uncommon. Mechanical issues, weather, and competing priorities often caused schedules to shift. The men remained in position and waited. 1500 hours came and went. There was no radio traffic. The platoon leader instructed the radio operator to contact the command post. The operator made the call. The response indicated that the helicopters had departed the fire base but had been diverted to support a unit in contact approximately 12 kilometers to the east. The new estimated time of arrival was 1600 hours. The platoon leader asked if the diversion was expected to cause further delays. The command post stated that the situation was being monitored and that updates would be provided as available. The men waited. The afternoon heat intensified. Insects became more active. The stillness of the jungle, which had seemed peaceful during the patrol, now felt oppressive. The platoon leader moved among the squads and checked on the men. He reminded them to stay hydrated and to remain alert. There was no indication of enemy presence, but the longer they remained in one location, the greater the risk of being observed. At 1600 hours, the radio operator again contacted the command post. The helicopters had completed their diversion and were preparing to launch for the extraction. Estimated time of arrival was now 16:45. The platoon leader noted the time and calculated that they had been waiting in the landing zone for nearly 3 hours. He reminded the squad leaders to maintain security and to avoid unnecessary movement. 16:45 passed. There was no sound of rotor blades. The radio operator made another call. The response was slower this time. The command post reported that weather conditions had deteriorated over the fire base. Low cloud ceiling and reduced visibility had grounded all rotary wing traffic. The extraction was postponed until weather improved. No new time estimate was provided. The platoon leader asked when an update would be available. The command post stated that the situation would be reassessed at first light the following morning. The platoon was instructed to move to a secure position, establish a night defensive perimeter, and await further instructions. The platoon leader acknowledged the message and gathered the squad leaders. The decision was made to move away from the landing zone. Remaining in the clearing overnight would leave them exposed. The platoon withdrew into the jungle and moved northeast for approximately 500 meters before establishing a perimeter in dense vegetation. The position was selected for concealment rather than comfort. The men set out claymore mines along likely avenues of approach, established watch rotations, and settled into silence. There was no fire, no unnecessary conversation. Discipline remained intact, but the mood had shifted. The certainty of extraction had been replaced by waiting. The night passed without incident. At first light, the platoon leader attempted radio contact with the command post. The signal was weak but readable. The weather over the firebase remained poor. Ceiling was estimated at 200 feet with intermittent rain. All flight operations were suspended until conditions improved. The command post instructed the platoon to remain in position and conserve resources. An update would be provided by noon. Rations were now critically low. The platoon leader consolidated what remained and redistributed it to ensure that each man received an equal share. The portions were small. Water was becoming a concern. The platoon had located a stream the previous day and had treated water using purification tablets, but the supply was not infinite. The platoon sergeant recommended that they establish a more sustainable position near a water source. The platoon leader agreed. The decision was made to move to the stream and establish a defensive perimeter that would allow access to water while maintaining security. The movement took most of the morning. The stream was located in a ravine surrounded by thick vegetation. The position offered good concealment but limited visibility. The platoon established a perimeter and began the process of treating water in small batches. The men filled canteens, added tablets, and waited the required time before drinking. The process was slow, but it was necessary. At noon, the radio operator made contact with the command post. The weather had not improved. Visibility remained limited, and flight operations were still suspended. The command post acknowledged the platoon's resource situation and stated that resupply by air was not possible under current conditions. The platoon was instructed to continue holding position and to minimize movement. The next scheduled communication window was set for 1800 hours. The platoon leader called the squad leaders together and explained the situation. There was no immediate danger, but the timeline for extraction was now uncertain. The focus needed to shift from short-term endurance to longer-term sustainability. Rations would be further reduced. Water discipline would be maintained. Movement would be kept to a minimum to conserve energy and avoid detection. The squad leaders returned to their positions and briefed their men. There were no complaints. The men understood the circumstances. The afternoon was spent in near silence. The jungle around them continued its routine. Birds called from the canopy. Insects moved through the undergrowth. The stream flowed steadily. The platoon remained still, watching, listening, waiting. At 1800 hours, the radio operator again contacted the command post. The weather was beginning to clear. Flight operations were expected to resume the following morning. Extraction was tentatively scheduled for 1000 hours. The platoon was instructed to return to the designated landing zone and prepare for pickup. The platoon leader acknowledged the message but noted to the platoon sergeant that the word tentatively was significant. Nothing was confirmed. They would move to the landing zone as instructed, but they needed to be prepared for further delays. The platoon remained in position overnight and began movement at first light. They reached the landing zone by 0900 hours and established security. The clearing was unchanged. The grass moved slightly in the morning breeze. The sky above was overcast but not threatening. The platoon leader confirmed their position with the command post and was told that the helicopters were preparing to launch. Estimated time of arrival was 10:15. At 10:15, the sound of rotor blades became audible in the distance. The men in the perimeter looked toward the sound. The noise grew louder, then stopped. The radio operator received a transmission. The helicopters had been rerouted to support a medical evacuation. The extraction was delayed. New estimated time of arrival was 1200 hours. The platoon waited. The morning grew warmer. The men remained in their positions, conserving energy, watching the tree line. At 1200 hours, there was no sound of helicopters. The radio operator contacted the command post. The response indicated that the medical evacuation had taken longer than expected. The helicopters were refueling. New estimated time of arrival was 1330. 1330 came. There was no radio traffic, no sound of aircraft. The platoon leader instructed the radio operator to make contact. The transmission was acknowledged, but the response was brief. The helicopters had encountered mechanical issues during refueling. The extraction was postponed indefinitely. The platoon was instructed to move to a secure position and await further instructions. The platoon leader stood in the center of the landing zone and looked at the tree line. The squad leaders were watching him. The men were silent. He turned to the platoon sergeant and spoke quietly. They would move back to the stream. They would establish a defensive position. They would conserve what resources remained. They would wait. The platoon withdrew from the landing zone and returned to the ravine. The perimeter was reestablished. The routine resumed. Water was treated, rations were divided, watch rotations were maintained. The men did not ask when extraction would occur. The question had become irrelevant. Days began to blend together. The platoon leader maintained radio contact with the command post on a scheduled basis. Each contact brought the same message: weather, mechanical issues, competing priorities. Extraction was delayed. No timeline was provided. The platoon was instructed to remain in position. The responses became shorter. The tone became more impersonal. The platoon was no longer a priority. Rations ran out on day 10. The platoon sergeant and the platoon leader discussed options. Foraging was possible but risky. Movement increased the chance of detection. The decision was made to remain in place and to rely on water and minimal local vegetation. The men supplemented their diet with plants that had been identified during training as safe to consume. The portions were small and provided limited nutrition, but they extended endurance. The psychological effect of prolonged waiting was more significant than the physical discomfort. The men had been trained to endure hardship, but they had also been trained to expect clear objectives and defined timelines. The absence of both created a sense of drift. The platoon leader and the platoon sergeant worked to maintain structure. Daily routines were enforced, equipment was maintained, security was not relaxed. The men responded to leadership because leadership remained consistent. On day 12, the radio operator reported that contact with the command post was becoming intermittent. The battery for the radio was weakening, and there was no means of recharging it. The platoon leader instructed the operator to limit transmissions to essential communication only. The scheduled check-ins were reduced from twice daily to once daily. Each transmission was kept as brief as possible. On day 14, the command post transmitted a message indicating that helicopter assets were being consolidated for a major operation in another area of operations. Extraction for units conducting routine patrols was being deprioritized. The platoon was instructed to continue holding position. An updated timeline would be provided when available. The platoon leader acknowledged the message and turned off the radio to conserve the remaining battery. He gathered the squad leaders and explained the situation. There would be no extraction in the immediate future. They needed to assume that they would be in position for an extended period. The focus now was survival and security. The squad leaders returned to their men and delivered the information without embellishment. The men accepted it. The platoon established a more permanent defensive position. Claymore mines were repositioned to cover all approaches. Observation posts were improved with better concealment. A schedule was created to rotate men through rest, security, and water collection duties. The position became a small, self-contained outpost deep in the jungle. On day 16, the radio battery died. The platoon leader attempted to make contact with the command post during the scheduled window. There was no response. He tried again. Nothing. The radio operator confirmed that the battery was depleted. There was no backup. Communication with higher command was no longer possible. The platoon leader called the squad leaders together and informed them that they were now operating independently. There would be no further instructions from the command post. There would be no updates on extraction. The platoon would need to make its own decisions. The immediate priority was to remain secure, to avoid contact with the enemy, and to sustain themselves until either extraction occurred or they received new orders through some other means. The platoon sergeant suggested that they consider moving toward the fire base. The distance was approximately 30 kilometers through difficult terrain, but it would allow them to re-establish contact with higher command and resupply. The platoon leader considered the option, but decided against it. Movement over that distance would require multiple days, would expose them to greater risk of enemy contact, and would take them through areas they had not reconnoitered. The safer option was to remain in position and wait. The days continued. The men adapted to the routine. Hunger became a constant but manageable presence. Energy levels dropped, but movement was minimal, so the demand for calories was reduced. Water remained available. The stream provided a reliable source. The jungle provided limited food in the form of edible plants and occasional small game, though hunting was avoided due to noise concerns. Morale did not collapse. The platoon remained disciplined. Leadership was consistent. The men trusted the platoon leader and the platoon sergeant. They understood that the situation was not the result of abandonment but of circumstances beyond immediate control. Weather, mechanical failures, and operational priorities had combined to create a situation in which extraction was not feasible. The men had been trained to adapt. They adapted. On day 21, the sound of helicopters became audible in the distance. The men in the perimeter looked up. The sound grew louder, then faded. The aircraft were not coming for them. The platoon leader noted the direction and estimated that the helicopters were supporting operations several kilometers to the south. It was the first indication in days that American forces were still active in the area. On day 23, a patrol from another unit passed within 200 meters of the platoon's position. The men remained silent and concealed. The patrol moved through quickly and did not detect the perimeter. After they had passed, the platoon leader considered whether to make contact. He decided against it. The patrol was moving with purpose and likely had its own mission. Attempting to link up could create confusion or compromise security for both units. On day 26, the sound of artillery fire was heard to the east. The platoon leader estimated the distance at 5 to 7 kilometers. The fire continued intermittently for several hours and then stopped. There was no indication of what had prompted it. The platoon remained in position. On day 28, a helicopter flew directly over the platoon's position at low altitude. It was a single aircraft, moving fast. The men did not signal. The helicopter continued on its route and disappeared. It was unclear whether it had been searching for them or conducting another mission entirely. On day 30, the platoon heard the sound of ground movement approaching from the north. The men moved into defensive positions and waited. The movement grew closer. Through the vegetation, the platoon leader observed a group of approximately 8 individuals moving along a trail. They were not in uniform but carried weapons and equipment consistent with enemy forces. The group passed within 50 meters of the perimeter and continued south. The platoon did not engage. The standing order remained: avoid contact unless fired upon. On day 32, the platoon leader decided that they needed to reassess their situation. They had been in position for over a month. Rations had been exhausted for weeks. The men were surviving on minimal food and were showing signs of weight loss and fatigue. No extraction had occurred. No communication had been possible. The platoon was effectively isolated. The platoon leader gathered the squad leaders and presented 2 options. The first was to continue holding position and wait for extraction or resupply. The second was to begin moving toward the firebase. The discussion was brief. The consensus was that continued waiting was sustainable but indefinite. Movement carried risk but offered the possibility of reestablishing contact with command. The decision was made to begin movement the following morning. The platoon prepared for the march. Equipment was consolidated. Unnecessary weight was discarded. The route was planned to avoid known trails and areas of likely enemy activity. The movement would be slow and cautious. The platoon sergeant estimated that the journey would take between 4 and 6 days, depending on terrain and the need for security halts. On the morning of day 33, the platoon broke down the perimeter and began moving east toward the firebase. The pace was deliberate. The men moved in a staggered column with scouts forward and security on the flanks. The terrain was difficult. Progress was measured in meters per hour rather than kilometers. On the second day of movement, the platoon encountered a small stream and stopped to refill canteens. While treating water, the point man reported movement ahead. The platoon halted and established hasty defensive positions. The platoon leader moved forward to observe. Through the vegetation, he saw a group of 4 individuals moving perpendicular to the platoon's line of march. They were armed and appeared to be conducting their own patrol. The platoon remained silent and concealed. The group passed without detecting them. On the 4th day of movement, the platoon reached a ridgeline that provided a clear view to the east. The platoon leader used binoculars to scan the terrain. In the distance, he could see the fire base. Smoke from cooking fires was visible. The distance was estimated at 8 kilometers. The platoon had made significant progress, but the final approach would be the most dangerous. The area surrounding the fire base was often patrolled by both American and enemy forces. The risk of being engaged by friendly fire was real. The platoon leader decided to halt for the night and planned the final approach carefully. The perimeter was established on the reverse slope of the ridge in dense cover. That evening, the platoon sergeant and the platoon leader discussed how to signal their approach. They had no radio. They had no flares. The decision was made to move to within visual range of the fire base and attempt to signal using a mirror or by displaying an American flag that had been carried by one of the riflemen. On the morning of day 37, the platoon began the final approach. They moved slowly and carefully, avoiding open areas and maintaining strict noise discipline. By midday, they had reached a position approximately 1 kilometer from the firebase perimeter. The platoon leader selected a location with a clear line of sight to the firebase and instructed one of the men to use a signal mirror to flash light toward the observation posts. The flashes were repeated at intervals. After 20 minutes, there was movement on the firebase perimeter. A patrol was dispatched. The platoon leader instructed his men to remain in position and to keep their weapons lowered but ready. The patrol approached cautiously. When they were within shouting distance, the platoon leader identified himself and his unit. The patrol leader confirmed the identity and radioed back to the fire base. Within an hour, the platoon was escorted inside the perimeter. The fire base commander met with the platoon leader immediately. The platoon was debriefed. The commander explained that the company command post had reported the platoon as missing after radio contact had been lost. Search efforts had been conducted, but the area of operations was large and resources had been limited. The assumption had been made that the platoon had either been captured or had suffered casualties that prevented communication. The fact that the entire unit had returned intact was unexpected. The platoon was provided with food, water, and medical evaluation. The men were underweight and fatigued, but otherwise in stable condition. There were no serious injuries. The platoon leader submitted a written report detailing the timeline of events, the delays in extraction, the loss of radio communication, and the decision to move toward the fire base. In the weeks that followed, the incident was reviewed by higher command. No formal fault was assigned. The delays in extraction were attributed to a combination of weather, mechanical issues, and operational priorities that had shifted resources to other areas. The loss of radio communication was noted as a contributing factor to the prolonged isolation. Recommendations were made to improve battery supply for units conducting extended patrols and to establish clearer protocols for units that lost communication. The experience of the 3rd Platoon was not unique. Throughout the Vietnam War, American units operating in remote areas faced similar situations. The reliance on helicopter extraction created vulnerability when that support was unavailable. Weather, mechanical failure, enemy activity, and competing priorities all affected the ability to provide timely support to units in the field. In many cases, delays were measured in hours. In others, they extended for days or weeks. The assumption that extraction would always be available shaped American tactical planning. Units were inserted with the expectation that they would be removed according to schedule. When that schedule could not be met, units were forced to adapt. Some were resupplied by air. Others moved to alternate extraction sites. Some, like the 3rd Platoon, waited in place and then moved on their own initiative when waiting became unsustainable. The psychological impact of prolonged isolation was significant, but difficult to quantify. Soldiers trained to operate with clear timelines and reliable support found themselves in situations where neither existed. The absence of communication, the uncertainty of rescue, and the need to make decisions without guidance required a level of independence and resilience that extended beyond standard training. Leadership at the small unit level became the determining factor in whether men maintained discipline or succumbed to panic. The 3rd Platoon endured 37 days in the jungle without resupply, without extraction, and ultimately without communication. They did so not because they were exceptional, but because they maintained the routines and discipline that had been drilled into them. They followed their leaders. They conserved resources. They avoided unnecessary risk. They adapted to circumstances and made decisions based on the information available to them. The story of units left waiting for extraction that did not come is not a story of heroism or tragedy. It is a story of procedure, discipline, and the realities of military operations in an environment where support could not always be guaranteed. The helicopter provided American forces in Vietnam with unprecedented mobility, but it also created dependence. When that dependence could not be met, soldiers found themselves alone in the jungle, relying on training, leadership, and their own endurance to survive until they could return. If you enjoyed this story, please follow.